Okay, thank you, Kiran, for joining me again today. We did the video last week, and a lot of people had some follow-up questions that I wanted to ask you. So first of all, let's touch on the big one that a lot of my peeps are asking about. What do you think is the connection between 5G rolling out in different cities and with the coronavirus?
I've looked into that to some degree because I've had a lot of people ask me that as well. And I don't, to be honest, I don't see a connection. 5G is likely going to be a problem for a lot of people. I don't think it's going to be a problem for everybody. There are people that are much more sensitive to those types of high frequency radio waves, than others are. And there's studies on the EMFs that come off cell phones and how that can increase the virulence factors with certain latent viruses and so on. But is 5G causing the symptomology and it's not actually a virus? As I've seen that. Somebody had sent me a video that was all this 30 minutes of explanation of how all of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 symptoms we are seeing is actually toxins oozing out of our cells because of 5G, and there's actually no virus at all.
Yeah, that was another one of my questions.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to say, I hope it doesn't insult anyone, but that's total nonsense. Because there is a virus. It's well documented. It's sequenced. Labs are working with it all over the world now. Working on understanding its pathologies and how it infects and what exactly it uses and all that. And there's nothing surprising about this from the scientific standpoint, right? This is a zoonotic transfer, which is a virus that jumps from species to species, which happens all the time, and has happened many a times in our even in our lifetime, but certainly in the history of the world, it's happened a lot. And this zoonotic transfer, the viruses get primed over time to infect a new type of host. There are loads and loads of viruses in birds and other animals that cannot infect us yet. That are pretty deadly for those animals because they don't have the mutations to bind and get into our cells. For example, this particular virus, binds to something called the ACE2 receptor, which I think we had talked about before, which is a receptor that's expressed on tissue that's undergoing damage. And when it binds, when it's trying to utilize that receptor to get in the cell, it has to have these proteases that it primes the receptor with. And that small mutation of priming the receptor with proteases allows it then to enter the human cell. Without that tiny mutation, which is just a few genes mutation that occurs just kind of randomly because viruses mutate incredibly frequently, it wouldn't be able to bind and infect the human cell at all. What is likely, and is a very interesting thing to think about, is that this coronavirus, this SARS-CoV-2, or versions of it, was likely circulating around the population much earlier than we think. And it was just not very infective versions of it. And it probably infected only just certain type of people. What I've been looking into, which I think is an interesting thing I wish epidemiologists that have better data sets can look into, is, are there lots of reports in late fall or even early fall of last year of mysterious respiratory illnesses around the world? We saw that in the US, but it was all tied to that vaping. If you remember, there were all these, somewhere around 380 people, not 380,000, 380 people died from a mysterious respiratory illness.
Oh yeah, I do remember hearing about that.
Yeah, but they kept relating it to vaping, right? And maybe it has to do with vaping, but maybe there's something in those pens that were contaminated with the corona type of virus. We don't know. We know cigarette smoke has a lot of lipopolysaccharide in it. That's one of the things that makes cigarette smoking so inflammatory to the lungs. So maybe there was a virion component to it. But what we've already seen is Iceland has reported 40 different versions of this virus that's circulating around their population. The CDC has reported at least 10 different versions of this virus. So viruses, just like influenza, just like the rotavirus and norovirus, all of them, HIV, they mutate a lot. So they change small characteristics of themselves. And that's not on purpose. It's just done because the replication machinery makes mistakes during the replication process. So it replaces one amino acid with another, or it replaces one gene with another. accidentally, which happens in us as well. That's how we end up with cancer cells. But that replication mistake is what gives you these different varieties of the virus. So I'm not finding any sort of plausible or recognizable connection between 5G. I think 5G is going to be problematic for certain people. I think most of us will be okay with it. But there are going to be people that are hypersensitive to it and will have issues.
So you don't believe that 5G is causing any of our issues with coronavirus, but do you think that in certain sensitive people that it may be making them more susceptible to it?
Yeah, I think that can be, sure. That's not out of the realm of possibility at all. I mentioned that there are studies on EMFs from your cell phone actually making latent viruses in your body, like Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, more virulent, right? Is it what they were showing is that the infectivity of those viruses increased. It's not clear whether it's because the virus itself changed based on the EMF, or it was your immune system gets suppressed, so then the virus has a better chance taking over. Those types of viruses that they study tend to be opportunistic viruses. So anytime your immune system is suppressed, like stress or anything else going on, then all of a sudden they pop up, right? So I think it can. I think it can have an impact on some people's immune systems, and which obviously is not a good thing when we're trying to fight this thing that's new to our system. But I don't think it's a whole lot more of an impact than other things that we have in our society, like Roundup, or processed foods or stress. All of these things impact our immune system in a very dramatic way, which negates our success in fighting this virus. I mean, one of the most profound things, blood sugar levels. There's more reports coming out of that. If people with high blood sugar levels tend to do much more poorly with this particular virus. So having higher uncontrolled blood sugar levels is a major risk factor for having a real serious adverse event with this virus.
Yeah, that really scares me because I have some diabetics in my family. So
Mm-hmm.
that makes me pretty nervous.
The key there is there was one report I saw recently that just being diabetic is part of the risk, but it's not the whole risk. Being diabetic and having uncontrolled blood sugar is the key,
Oh,
right? So you can be diabetic, but if you are taking your insulin and metformin or whatever it is that's been prescribed to you to manage your blood sugar, and you're keeping your blood sugar in that healthy range, you're not eating crazy things, then the risk comes way down. So it's
okay.
about the level, which actually is good in a way for diabetics, because they don't have to feel like, oh, I'm diabetic, I'm screwed. Well, I'm diabetic, but let me be really careful with my range of blood sugar.
Okay, good.
And the thing about it is, to me, is this was completely predictable. In fact, scientists have been publishing about corona type viruses, influenza type of viruses, very similar to these kind of viruses, are the one that we're dealing right now, that are likely the next global pandemic. Because when you look at from the scientific perspective, you see all of that, right? You see what can and does happen in nature. And we've had loads of pandemics in the history of the world. So this is not a weird, unusual thing at all. One of the things I started looking into was the last H1N1, because the H1N1 was a relatively bad pandemic when you look at it, with number of people that died. The part I think that was more anxiety stricken or anxiety, driving of that one was because children were affected even more. I think any pandemic where kids are dying is going to be a lot more of an angst on society. And that one was, right? So children are being affected in large numbers. But then I realized, like, as I'm going through it, where we were technologically at that time, right? We didn't have this stuff. We didn't have Zoom. We didn't have YouTube. Facebook only had, I think, 400 million users, which sounds like a lot, but right now I think they have something like 4 billion users. Instagram didn't exist. None of this social media stuff existed. The 24-hour news cycle didn't exist. So our awareness of it was so much more narrow, right? So it didn't seem like as big of a deal. Now, because we're so hyper aware and so hyper exposed to everything, it is such a bigger deal for us. So that's why this seems like the end of the world kind of stuff that's going on. But as a society, we've gone through this in the past. This is not the first time. It will come around again. It could be in the next 6-7 years. I think, I don't know if I mentioned this on when last time we talked, but The World Health Organization has an entire pandemic team that follows a bunch of zoonotic viruses that they've already identified, and they're monitoring their jump to humans. So, the last big influenza pandemic was the H1N1, right?
Yeah.
Like H1N1, there are many variations of that virus. There's H6N5, H7N10, all of these variations. There's literally hundreds of variations of those viruses that the WHO is following and monitoring all the time. These are found in birds right now, and they haven't made the jump to humans. There have been here and there 1 or 2 cases of humans who handle lots of birds getting infected by it. And then they quickly isolate that person, study, quarantine it and all that, and ensure that that virus doesn't start replicating to where it's much more contagious from human to human. So this is not an unusual thing. It's not an outlandish thing from a scientific standpoint. Completely predictable. There are papers predicting a corona-like virus because we had the SARS, which is a coronavirus. We had MERS, which is a coronavirus. And so the difference between this virus and those is that this virus has mutated to be much more contagious from person to person, and has this long latency period where you can have viral replication and you can pass it on to somebody before you have symptoms.
What about when you go out, do you wear a mask, and what kind?
So I haven't gone out yet, but like I literally have not. I've left the house just to be outside.
Oh yeah, you get your groceries brought in, you said, right?
I do. I haven't delivered, but I did get some of those 3-ply surgical masks, and I'll definitely be wearing them when I go out. And that's for 2 reasons. Number one, I think it's better and I think we'll start to see. We're already seeing signs of the curve flattening to some degree, right? I think New York is reporting slightly lower numbers of day-to-day new incidents. I think California is reporting that as well. So, it was predictable that sometime in April, if we put in all of these social distancing measures, we'll start to see flattening of curve. What will start to happen is as the curve starts to come down, actually, then we could start easing up some of the social distancing, but it'll be very important for everyone to wear masks. And the reason for that is, again, it's not that the mask will necessarily, if someone sneezes in your face who's infected, it's not that the mask will protect you necessarily. It's for those that are asymptomatic carriers, right? So if you are an asymptomatic carrier, if you're wearing a mask, it dramatically reduces the amount of respiratory droplets that come out of you from talking, breathing, and all that. And then if you sneeze and hold on to the mask, especially with your arm, then you really protect those respiratory droplets from getting out. And then I would wear one just because it helps me touch my face less, makes me a little bit more aware of it. And if I do touch my face, I'm touching it on the mask, which is better than touching directly on my face. And there is some minor protection against potential respiratory droplets as well.
So what kind of mask would you suggest then?
I actually bought these, they're called surgical masks, right? They're disposable surgical masks. They are 3-ply surgical masks. They tend to be water resistant, so you can actually put them over the top of a cup and pour water on it, and you'll see the water just sitting there, won't go through it. And those are disposable, so they just have the ear loop, and they're still available. You could find them in a number of websites.
I thought that the virus was so small that most masks won't make a difference.
They do. It's not the virus itself, right? So the virus is floating in a respiratory droplet, right? So the virus on its own cannot fly around in the atmosphere. It has to be inside a respiratory droplet, whether it's aerosolized or it's a larger droplet, right? So what we're blocking is a droplet. So when someone talks or when someone breathes and coughs, their respiratory droplets contain virus in it. The mask will capture those respiratory droplets, and the virus will be sitting in those respiratory droplets.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So what do you know about the terrain theory versus the germ theory?
Yeah, so to me, ultimately, it's probably a combination of the two, right? So one says that germs exist and they're out there, and then they get into a host in some way, whether it's through your eyes, nose, mouth, through food, through your skin, whatever it may be, entering the host, and then it starts infecting a host. The other one says that germs are actually created within a weakened host, right? So that there are biological opportunities for certain germs to actually be created because of the terrain being favorable for that creation of the germ. Now,
Which is basically like saying that your immune system is lower. It's not as
right,
strong, correct? Yeah.
yeah. Now, the truth is, and those were the theories back in Louis Pasteur's day, right? So Louis Pasteur's day was a long time ago, and since then we know a lot more about microbiology and immunology and so on. To me, it's really a combination of the two. I think both can exist, right? But both are dependent in terms of how we feel about it. What it does to us is completely dependent on our immune response. We have pathogens entering us every day, all the time, right? And I think people don't quite realize how often it is we encounter pathogens. We do that all the time, every day. 99.99% of the time, we feel nothing because our immune system takes care of it like that, right? Now, those of us that have a weakened constitution may feel sick much more often. One way of illustrating how often we encounter pathogens, just look at kids. Kids, because they have still kind of an immature immune system in terms of its memory and capability to respond to things that it's seen before, kids tend to get sick around 5 to 6 times a year, right? That's average for kids. They don't get really badly sick. They get colds, flus, they get sniffles, they get diarrhea, aches and pains, and all that. On average, in the westernized world, your kids are getting sick 5 to 6 times a year, right? Most adults don't get sick that often. Most adults get sick typically twice a year. And so that just illustrates how often we actually are exposed to things. And then a couple of times a year, when the condition is right, meaning we get a larger dose and our constitution's weaker, then the virus or the bacteria has a chance to take over. Now, at the same time, viruses and bacteria and all that can mutate within a host, right? So if you are a host with a weakened constitution and you allow latent infections means bacteria or viruses that are allowed to remain within your system for long periods of time. For most of the time, they don't cause any symptomology, but they can mutate during those periods. And then should you go under stress and your system gets especially weak, they can signal that, they can detect that through the signals, and they will come out and rear their head, right? So that's the same with viruses like cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr, that respond to stress signals in the body, right? So why is it that these viruses start to replicate and cause their infection when we are stressed? Well, because they've adopted the idea that when the host is expressing stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, the host is likely in a weakened state, and then they go, okay, guys, this is a great opportunity to infect. Our host is weak, and then they start replicating themselves. Or in the case of virus, they start hijacking more cells to replicate themselves. So, and bacteria do this too. So, for example, Listeria monocytogenes is a bacteria, one of the most common foodborne illnesses, right? Well, you can get a certain amount of Listeria into your system through contaminated food. The Listeria goes in, some of it survives through the gastric system, gets into the intestines. Now the Listeria will sit there and talk to each other, and they will figure out how many of them are there. And they've learned over time that depending on their concentration, they should remain quiet and stay under the radar because there's not enough of them to cause an actual illness. So there is a clinically infective dose of that bacteria, meaning once the bacteria is allowed to very quietly replicate and get themselves to a level where they feel that, okay, there's enough of us that we can wreak havoc in this host, then they send messages to each other and they all turn on their virulence factors and toxin production at the same time to try to overwhelm the host's immune system. So until then, they sit there in stealth mode and very quietly replicate to get to their numbers, right? And that is part terrain and part immune system, but it is an outside coming in pathogen. There are pathogens that can be created within the system. They can mutate in the system. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria were created in hosts, right? They're created either in farm animals or in human hosts. That's why doctors tell you if you do end up with an antibiotic, make sure to finish your course, because if you don't finish your course, you're giving those bacteria just enough antibiotics where they can somehow resist the concentration and develop mutant versions that end up resistant to that antibiotic, right? So those kind of mutants can develop in a susceptible host, just as how a cancer cell develops in a susceptible host. And cancer cells are developing every hour of every day in everybody, right? We all have continuous cancer cells being developed in us. The immune system detects it, comes and shuts it down, right? And so that all that fighting is constantly happening. It's happening all the time, every minute of every day. So it's really a combination of the two. For an outside pathogen to come in and actually cause illness in you, your immune system has to be either not functioning optimally or it has never seen that pathogen. If it's never seen that pathogen, then you're going to have a period of feeling sick until the immune system can figure out how to deal with that pathogen. If it's seen the pathogen before, which many of the pathogens we encounter we've seen in the past, and your immune system is working well, you'll never even know you encountered it, because the immune system will immediately knock it out. With the antibodies, you don't get the fever, you don't get the inflammation, you don't feel anything. So it's a combination of the two. I think both are right in many ways, but ultimately what it means is we have to keep our immune system functioning properly. It's the only defense mechanism we have in our body, right? And our immune system is dependent on our microbiome. It's dependent on our own lifestyle and behavior. It is suppressed by our own stress. It's suppressed by toxins in the world around us. So we have to be more and more aware of all these things that compromise our immunity and work against them.
So I guess speaking of that, then one of the things that really helps build up our immune system, obviously, is Just Thrive. So Kent and I don't ever miss taking those. We take 2 a day.
Yeah.
I know on the bottle, I think it just says 1 a day, right, Kiran?
Yeah, it does. That's your regular good old maintenance. In pandemic times and times of being more stressed and going through everything that we're all going through together, it's always, I always bump up my dose. So I would be at the 2 to 3 a day level.
Yeah, right. I'm just trying to get my kids to be taking it more regularly too, but Kent and I are pretty consistent in that. So yeah, it's nice to have that, knowing that that's sort of an extra boost to our immune system, that along with, all the other things, eating well, healthy fats, and getting good sleep, and not being stressed,
Yep.
and, all those things. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Kiran, for answering some more questions.
My pleasure. Thank you.